about the age of development, meaning that the so-called less developed countries, backward countries, have now got to enter the age of development to partake in the process of change and development and modernization. Now, the focus of development then was basically on economic growth, and many theories and models were developed. I don't want to go into this, but what I want to stress here is that out of this discourse on development after the Second World War, right into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, are certain terminologies or concepts which I term as the tyranny of dominant categories. I'm sticking my neck out by calling this as the tyranny of dominant categories, because during that time, terms like less developed countries, backward countries, developing countries, and so on were bandied around so much that the term became a so-called backward. People do not want to be labeled as backward or living in less developed countries. They want to develop, to modernize, and to go beyond. That means to participate in the so-called age of development. Now, out of this, there were many problems after the launching of the so-called the age of development, various development programs by international agencies, by various governments, and so on. We find that development was not really the answer. The kind of development that were proposed was not the answer. So here, I put here, there were a number of discontents arising from the development programs that were being proposed and implemented. Discontent number one, I term as the revolution of rising expectations and the revolution of rising frustrations. If you flash back, you find that United Nations have categorized or have announced the 1960s as the first decade of development, 1970s as the second decade, and the 80s was supposed to be the third development decade, but it turned out to be, because of the lack of progress in development in many parts of the world, especially in Africa, in Latin America, and so on, and in some parts of Asia, the 1980s became to be labeled later on as the lost decade of development, or the failures of development. So because of the failures of the development programs imposed from the perspective of modernization, various scholars at that time sum up the developments as there was a revolution of rising expectations, because people in the newly independent countries expected their countries and their societies to be taken out of the backward or so underdeveloped stage, but their dreams and expectations were not fulfilled. So scholars like Ganamadal, for example, in his book, in his voluminous classic work, The Asian Drama, labeled that as the revolution of rising expectations, to be followed by the revolution of rising frustrations. There were tremendous frustrations in various parts of the world, Asia, Latin America, Africa, and all that. So I think that's discontent one. But in terms of knowledge construction, from the perspective of social science, what do we have in those years? We have, on the one hand, the theories of modernization, Rostow, sociologists like Tucker Parsons, psychologists like McClellan and various others, what do you call it, the school of modernization theories, versus development studies, from the neo-Marxist perspective, from the statist perspective, and all that. And if you remember, the 1980s, we saw the rise of neoliberalism and market-led globalization. And that development studies that emerged in the 60s and 70s, which was, that era was really the era of flourishing development studies, but because of the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s and the attack on the states, the rise of Washington Consensus as well, and so we find the demise or the cul-de-sac being faced by development studies then, so that they declined in the 80s, late 80s especially. So anyway, if you look back, that was in terms of knowledge construction, we saw the contestations between the different schools of thought on the development paradigm. Okay, this content two, what I will label there as big gaps within and between nations. In 2005, there's a book by Thomas Friedman called The World is Flat. Now he referred to the IT world, that on the IT platform, you more or less can flatten the world. So he used the term, the world is flat. But a year later, Professor Jomo, who was the former president of the Malaysian Social Science Association, he was then working in the United Nations as the Assistant Secretary General. He and his team came up with a book called Flat World, Big Gaps. Yeah, you claim that it is a flat world, but there are so big gaps within societies, within countries, and also between countries. So, why the gaps? And I think this is very important. Put here in terms of the sharp imbalances, the conflict between humans and nature, there is the interactions between human beings with the environment, and of course the sharp inequalities between peoples, within nations and also between nations. And some examples of the big gaps, I don't want to go into details on this. Despite so many decades of development, you still find that 1 out of 5 or 1.4 billion people today lives in poverty. 1.25 US dollar a day, which is very low. I mean, this is according to the World Bank. Lack of basic amenities, no electricity, 1.5 billion. No toilet, 2.5 billion. This is the reality in the world today. Hunger, almost 1 billion people are hungry every day. And so on and so forth. So these are the big gaps that we see. And in terms of inequality, measured by the Gini coefficient, we find that across the countries that were supposed to be developed, that were supposed to be undergoing the development programs that we were talking about earlier on. That means the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, you can see that the levels of inequalities are very high as measured by the Gini. And the countries with low inequalities are those in the Nordic countries. Sweden, Norway, Finland. Whilst inequalities are very high in Africa, very high also in Latin America, somewhere in the middle in East Asia, and Southeast Asia, but still on the higher side, not really very much in the middle. So we find that despite the development programs, inequalities in countries that are supposed to have developed and progressed are still facing what we termed just now as big gaps. Now, there's briefly the situation in Malaysia. 1970, the Gini was 0.5. The higher the Gini, that means the more inequalities, which is out of 1. It went down, but since 2012, it is going up again. And today, if we look at the development literature, there are new discourses on inequality, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. And I'm quoting here from Jean Peters, who said that the combined effects of deregulation, financialization, managerialism, and CEO super salaries have resulted in the stagnation of incomes for the majority and a steep rise in inequality. Okay. Now, in terms of knowledge construction, I mentioned just now that towards the end of the 80s and early 1990s, the earlier wave of development studies faced some kind of cul-de-sac. But scholars, as agencies, did not sit still, but they kept on trying to uncover new knowledge and to put forward new paradigms. So you find a re-emergence of development studies, but a new and diverse wave. It's not homogeneous. So you find, say, for example, people like Mahabul Haq, Amartya Sen, proposing human development as a model, human development index as a way of measuring, and then they produced the annual human development report, which started in 1990. There are also discourses on alternative development, and some groups of thinkers and activists have talked about post-development. That means trying to get away from the kind of development paradigm that have been imposed upon the world. Now, that is in terms of knowledge construction. Now, I just want to briefly draw your attention to the human development because this is very popular. In fact, Malaysia has started the National Human Development Report, supposed to be published last year. Now, the gist or the basic premise of human development, as articulated by Mahbubul Haq and Amartya Sen, is that people are the real wealth of nations. And from this kind of thinking, you have got the Millennium Development Goals being launched in 2000, supposed to be realized by 2015, that is next year, but many of the goals have not yet been met. And that's, in terms of human development thinking, the basic purpose of development is to enlarge people's choices, to create an enabling environment for people to enjoy long, healthy, and creative lives. And there's a quote from Amartya Sen: human development is about advancing the richness of human life rather than the richness of the economy in which human beings live, which is only a part of it. I think that kind of thinking is very important. Okay, there's discontent too, big gaps within nations and between nations. Now, the third discontent, I would put it as issue which refers to the environment. Now, the issues of the environment have been debated for a long time, and if you look back in the development literature, you have got a book called The Limits to Growth, published in 1972, in the era when development was so captivating, so tantalizing in the various parts of the developing world. Now, this was by a team of writers commissioned by the Club of Rome, the Meadows and their colleagues, and they published reports. I think recently they published the 4 decades of report on the limits of growth. The argument is that development has limits. Development has caused pollution, destruction of the ecosystem, caused climate change, caused global warming, and so on, which in turn have a tremendous negative impacts on human beings, on society, and on nature. And out of the concern about environment, we have the World Commission on the Environment and Development, or the Brundtland Commission report in 1987, which came up with a captivating report, or the title of which called Our Common Future. That means the future together of humanity, whether in the developing countries, underdeveloped countries, or the developed countries. And it was the first time that the concept of sustainable development was articulated in 1987 in the Brundtland report. And then in 1992, we have the UN Summit at Rio with the Agenda 21, and it was out of the concerns about environment and development that in UKM, the Institute of Development and the Institute of Environment and Development or Land Study was set up, of which Prof. Ibrahim Komo was one of the founding members then in 1995 at UKM. In 2012, we have 2 decades after the Earth Summit, Rio plus 20. But the progress in conserving and protecting the environment there's some progress, but there are much more to be taken note of. And at the Rio plus 20 meeting in 2012, there's a call for the need of renewed political deal and a reaffirmation of the document that was published in 1987, Back to Our Common Future. That means we shouldn't lose track that we share the future together, back to our common future. So there seems to be a new paradigm emerging out of Rio. The MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which are supposed to be ended by 2015, by next year. There's a new discussion now about looking beyond the MDGs. They talk about Sustainable Development Goals, which encompass 3 dimensions: environmental, economic, and social and economic in that trio. So in terms of knowledge construction, if in the earlier decades, the study of environment was basically based on disciplines, we have seen in the last several years the emergence of going beyond disciplines, what we call the emergence of sustainability science, which is multidisciplinary or even transdisciplinary, trying to incorporate various dimensions of development. Okay, that is this content 3. This content 4 is on the issue of transformation versus displacement or exclusion. Now, we have heard the word social transformation being bandied about very frequently. It is a big term which has been used in terms of social transformation as an empirical process in the world. It is driven by globalization, by economic growth, by movements of people, and by ICT. And these transformations, beside enabling people to be mobile, to move between countries, between places, to achieve mobility and so on, but have created unsettling conditions for the human beings. So the issue arising from social transformation is that how to manage social transformation to ensure sustainability of societies and the environment, and at the same time improve the human conditions. And out of this concern about the impacts of deep-going social transformation and the need to manage it, UNESCO has launched a program called the Management of Social Transformation in 1994. And it's worthy to note that this afternoon, towards the end of the day, we have a special roundtable on development, sustainability, and social inclusion. And our UNESCO representative, together with Professor Ibrahim, who is from Sustainability Science, and I think Professor Dagmar will be participating in that roundtable. Now, in terms of knowledge construction, if before we have been so used to the term development studies, now we hear of the term transformation studies. It's not just development studies, but transformation studies. We look at things beyond the economics, beyond development, which is multidisciplinary. And what is what needs to be emphasized is that transformation studies is social science driven, whilst sustainability studies is science driven, but with social science included. Transformation studies is social science driven, but with the science dimension also included. And one of the main concerns of transformation studies is, of course, on social inclusion, on overcoming vulnerabilities, and on the need for the participation of multiple stakeholders. Okay, that is the fourth discontent, and the rise of knowledge construction or corpus of knowledge in order to engage with that, with those developments. And the fifth discontent, I label this as the globalization hype, the mirage of the borderless flat world. We all have been very much taken up by the buzzword globalization in the 1990s, especially. Thinkers like Kenichi Omai, Alvin Toffler, and a number of others in the 1990s have been publishing various books on the subject. And the Malaysian Prime Minister at that time, Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, also talked a lot about globalization. And one of the outcomes of his concerns with the globalization process is, of course, the birth of the Multimedia Super Corridor, MSC. Not our MSC, but his MSC. Globalization basically brings about the interconnectedness of peoples, of countries, of nations in the world. There is also what is called time-space compression, and the movements of people across borders, international migration. And in terms of culture, there is a big debate on homogenization versus heterogenization. Also of hybridization and hybridity. Now, Apadurai talks about the five scapes: ethnoscapes, technoscapes, financescapes, and ideoscapes. You have to read the book to know the details. And I'm happy to recognize here the contribution of the Malaysian scholar, Saudara Wan Sawawi, who in his edited volume, Social Science and Knowledge in a Globalizing World, took up the issue of the scapes put forward by Apadurai and introduced a sixth dimension or sixth scape called the knowledge scape. And I think that is what this is an example of trying to engage with knowledge and at the same time make our own contribution. But the concern here with globalization is that globalization creates winners and losers. It creates captors and captives. And from our perspective, we don't want to be the losers. We don't want to be the captors. So, and that's why there isn't this term called, is it globalization or is it recolonization? That is the discontent with globalization. Now, in terms of knowledge construction, I'm quoting here from Jean Pieters, and just to inform you that Jean Pieters is one of the leading scholars on global studies today, and he will be the fifth Port Rafiah chairholder at the Institute of Malaysian International Studies, ICMAS, come this September, hopefully. Okay, according to Jean Pieters, the globalization literature has been with us for the last 3 decades, since 1980s. But his argument is that the studies on globalization, since it started in 1980s, right through to now, has been very much discipline-based. And he calls that as the first wave of globalization literature. And in the 1990s or so, he said, we have got a huge stock of knowledge on globalization, huge database on that as well. So he calls that as the second wave. But out of this huge globalization literature and the database that has been developed on globalization, there needs to be a synthesis, a double synthesis, he calls it, in order to raise this knowledge further beyond the globalization literature. And he coined the term global studies as the third wave, the new interdisciplinary, innovative kind of corpus of knowledge. That's the global studies represents the third wave of research because global knowledge and data exist prior to category of globalization. Now, according to Peters, the development of global studies signals a step beyond 1990s global studies, and that global studies is a double synthesis of diverse global knowledge and of globalization studies. And in terms of its character, it is interdisciplinary, combining diverse databases, and seeks to provide kaleidoscopic and panoramic perspectives on global conditions and cognitions. Okay, to sum up this part of my presentation, knowledge construction related to development and its discontents. First, we have, of course, the social science disciplines and social science as a whole and the various disciplines associated with social science. And then we have development studies, the first wave, 1960s to 80s. And then development studies, a new wave, since 1990s. We have the studies of environment, discipline-based, which is the first wave. And then we have sustainability science, which is interdisciplinary, or even transdisciplinary, which is the new wave. And then we have transformation studies, especially since the 1990s, which is multidisciplinary. Before that, it was the studies of social change. And then we have got studies of globalization, the first wave since 1980s, and then knowledge and data on globalization, second wave 1990s onwards. And then now they call it global studies, the third wave since 2000, which is multidisciplinary. Now, to sum up further, from these studies, from the critics of developments, and from the recognition of the various contents of development, we have got to underline the fact that development is not just economic, but multidimensional. That at the core of development is human beings, not states or markets. States and markets are to serve human beings, to bring about improvement in the human conditions, and that the bounties of nature are not to be indiscriminately destroyed and consumed for profit or greed, but for life generation, and that it should be protected as part of natural heritage for future generation. And I use a quote there from Mahatma Gandhi: "The earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not everyone's greed." Now, in terms of knowledge construction, single disciplines have been challenged to be more open and integrative, to go beyond their borders, and to start becoming more interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, or even transdisciplinary. Okay, that is more or less the first part. Now I want to move on to the Malaysian development paradigm. Malaysia, we have heard about the term called the rise of the South. This is a report by the UNDP. And that Malaysia, as part of the South, has been partaking in the road of development. Now, what has been the Malaysian development paradigm? And here I want to refer to the speech by the Prime Minister of Malaysia on 28th February 1991, which was later came to be called the Vision 2020 speech. Now, what Mahathir said then was that hopefully, and I think this is very important, talking about categories, right? Hopefully, the Malaysian who is born today, and he was speaking in 1991, who is born today and in the years to come, will be the last generation of our citizens who will be living in a country that is called developing. So he wants to get out of the category, that tyranny of categories, developing. So because developing is not good enough. The ultimate objective that we should aim for is for a Malaysia that is a fully developed country, by the year 2020. Malaysia should not be developed only in the economic sense, I'm quoting him further. It must be a nation that is fully developed along all dimensions, economically, politically, socially, spiritually, psychologically, and culturally. We must be fully developed in terms of national unity and social cohesion, in terms of our economy, in terms of social justice, political stability, system of government, quality of life, social and spiritual values, national pride, and confidence. Very aspirational. I mean, those are the gist of the statement. And to achieve that, the road to it, from his perspective, was the economy must grow by 7% on average. Now, of course, you know, Mahathir was stepped down in October 2003 and replaced by Abdul Badawi. And Abdul Badawi came out with his national mission, with his own idea about how to move forward, the national mission, and then Islam Hadari, as opposed to Muslim Hadari. Of course, there is a debate between Islam Hadari and Muslim who should be Hadari. And then he came up also with the National Integrity Plan, which is to make integrity a way of life versus corruption as a way of life. And there is a panel on corruption and integrity on the third day, right, by the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission and also the Institute of Integrity Malaysia. Now, of course, Dr. Mahathir was not happy with these pronouncements because of the dismantling of some of his mega projects by his successor, and the national mission in a way overshadowed what he called Vision 2020. But Pakla, Abdullah Badawi, said that no, national mission is to implement Vision 2020. But anyway, those are the political polemics between the two. But the point is that in terms of policy perspectives, to move forward towards 2020 under Abdullah Badawi is through these three, categories: national mission, Islam Hadari, and the National Integrity Plan. Abdullah Badawi was replaced by Dato Najib Razak, and he came up with the concept of One Malaysia, whilst Mahathir came up with the concept of Bangsa Malaysia in 1991. Right? And in terms of economic development towards 2020, he introduced the new economic model and the government transformation program in order to achieve the translation of the new economic model. And then to do so, the plan identified the National Key Results Areas, or NKRA. I don't want to go into details on this, but let's have a quick look at the goals of the new economic model. The goals of the new economic model are high income. By 2020, we should be having a per capita income of US 15,000 to 20,000 from the present 7,000. Right? Quality of life, and of course there is the definition of sustainability there, and also inclusiveness being defined there. But what is interesting to note is that under the new economic model, the characteristics of Malaysia by 2020 are as shown in the box there. Market-led, that means back to economic, the omnipresence of the market. Well-governed, regionally integrated, entrepreneurial, and innovative. So the thinking, you can see that among the planners, there is market is the engine, not only the engine of growth, but also providing the leadership in terms of moving towards 2020. So where is the idea of developed nation then? Now that is the question that social scientists can raise. Now just go further into the idea of the new economic model towards 2020. Making Malaysia a high-income country. You mentioned that just now about the gross national income 523 billion US, 6% growth per annum of GDP. So you can see there is a shift in the discourse there. Okay, so what are the challenges for the social science then, given the development ideas in terms of global knowledge construction that I talked in terms of global scenarios and in terms of Malaysian development paradigm that we talked about just now? I think in the context of social science, we need perhaps to differentiate between two types or dimensions of discipline knowledge. One is called instrumental knowledge, which is specific for certain objectives, and the other is reflexive knowledge, which is critical and for the public. I'm using here the concepts introduced by Professor Michael Borowai, the outgoing president of the International Sociological Association, who was in Malaysia early last year. And there needs to be reflexive discourse. I mean, instrumental knowledge is meant for policy making, meant for policy implementation, that is fine. But should social scientists just echo that and just accept that? Or do we need to do something more than that? I think that is the question. That's a challenge for social science. And I suggest here the need for reflexive discourse, because if we just simply accept instrumental knowledge, then we will be stuck. We will not be able to move beyond in terms of advancing the corpus of knowledge that we hold so dearly. So what is of concern here in terms of discourse, I mean, taking the perspective of reflexive knowledge, is that the discourse has shifted from developed nation to high-income nation. And in fact, if you read the statements by Dato Idris Jalla, who's in charge of the transformation program, he talked about a rich nation. Rich, high income and rich nation is supposed to be equivalent. A rich nation or high-income nation is quantifiable, it's easy. What about the non-quantifiable? What about the intangibles? KPIs, key performance indicators, is quantifiable. But what about the KIPs, the key intangibles? I think that is the discourse that is missing here. And I think this is the role of the social scientists, that we have got to look very seriously into this. That's what do we mean by developed nation? What do we mean by a high-income nation? We have got to define. We cannot take policymakers' definition for granted. That's what I'm saying. This is not saying that, we are opting out of the process. But what we are saying is that as social scientists, as scholars, it's our duty to interrogate the concepts and give our own perspective and definition on it. Okay, that is the first challenge, I think, moving forward for the social scientists. The second thing is more discipline in terms of our disciplines. I've talked about early on about the shifts in disciplines from monodisciplines to interdiscipline to multidiscipline and to transdisciplinary. In the various studies that we have mentioned just now. But I just want to underscore one point. Despite the move towards being interdisciplinary, to collaborate among the social scientists, among the humanities, even with the scientists and so on, that is very good. But we have got to be strong in our disciplines too. Otherwise, where are the theories going to come from? Where are the methodologies going to come from? I think we have got to see that whilst there's a need for multidisciplinary, the need to move beyond the borders of our disciplines, but we have got to be strong in terms of our mastery of knowledge in our disciplines. That's the second challenge. The third, the conceptualization of paradigms. And I think this is a big issue. I just mentioned just now one of the things that we talked about here. High-income nation versus developed nation, that is to be unpacked, to be conceptualized scientifically. What do we mean by this in terms of the context of the age today? Not about the 1960s or 50s or 70s, but in the early 21st century, what do we mean by developed nation? Does it mean the same as what the West was when they became developed nation as defined by their thinkers? I think this is very important. And I want to propose also here that once we have been talking about economic growth, which is a very captivating concept, but what about societal growth? This is a concept that I think have got to be articulated and enriched to become part of the discussion, part of the discourse of knowledge. And to me, societal growth is a multidimensional concept that refers to growth in institutions, not just the growth rate of the economy, but growth institutions, especially governance institutions at all levels, the growth in culture, the growth of values, especially values of ethics, integrity, and caring values, the growth of social equality, social capital, human relationships, and respect for diversity and social inclusion. I think that's what societal growth should be. And I think moving forward, should be one of the pillars, conceptual pillars that we have got to engage with in the move towards 2020 and beyond. Third is to overcome the tyranny of certain dominant paradigms, not all, but what I'm suggesting here is not to be too enthralled by the dominant paradigms, that we also can be creative and innovative. And I want to bring back to you what one of the members of the first generation of Malaysian social scientists, Syed Hussein Alatas, who talked about the captive mind and the creative mind. Our minds should not be captured by dominant global frames created through ranking, rating, and what have you. That we have got to break through this and come up with our own concept. So in other words, we have to interrogate and don't take things for granted. And the last point, this is a very important programmatic point, that Malaysian social sciences and humanities have been here since 1960s. But if you take University of Singapore as big, University of Malaya that was established in Singapore in 1949, you can go back a bit earlier. But the growth of social sciences and humanities became more, visible, became more impactful from the 60s onwards. That's why we take it as more or less the beginning of the history of social science and humanities in Malaysia, commensurate with the independence. But despite the fact that it is already almost 60 years, the social sciences and humanities have contributed so much to the development of the country, have produced and have trained and produced social scientists who become administrators, leaders, politicians, scholars, and so on and so forth for the country. But till today, there is no such thing called the Academy of Social Sciences and Humanities in Malaysia. To reflect, to recognize the importance of this corpus of knowledge called social science and humanities. The sciences have got the Academy of Sciences established under the Academy of Science Act 1994. So 1994, this is 2014, 20 years. Very good. I mean, I'm not begrudging the scientists. But what I'm trying to stress is that the policymakers have got to recognize that both sciences and social sciences and humanities are